Good morning, members of the press, fellow Canadians, and political candidates in this election. I'm David Matsinye, Director of Research, Policy and Advocacy at Amnesty International Canada, the English-speaking section. I'm joined on the stage and on Zoom by my colleagues from the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability, David Suzuki Foundation, National Right to Housing Network, and Project Plowshares. They will each introduce themselves when they speak. Before we begin, let us acknowledge that we are gathered on unceded and surrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, a land steeped in history that is often silenced, yet is enduring and alive. We are citizens of a nation built on the dispossession and violence against indigenous peoples. We live on this land and work on this land with humility and gratitude, so may we be worthy. We are here to say that in this election, human rights are not party possessions. They are the universal heritage of humanity, the protection, promotion, and fulfillment of which is the duty of all governments at all levels. They must be central in this election and in the next government. We are 6 organizations working together in defense of human rights. Our human rights platform lays out 9 loud cries for justice, dignity, and equality that Canada must not muffle or sidestep. The platform is now available to the public, calling on all political parties in this election and the government that follows to confront the demands of our collective conscience. First, in order to truly advance Indigenous people's rights and self-determination, the next government must end discriminatory elements of the Indian Act, uphold free, prior, and informed consent, investigate potential criminal activities at residential schools, fully implement the Indigenous Languages Act, and substantially fund initiatives to end the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Second, the increasing use of Section 33, the notwithstanding clause of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, threatens the guarantees and protections of fundamental rights, particularly the right of 2S LGBTQ+ communities. Therefore, the next government must work with provinces to end the use of the notwithstanding clause to override rights. End discriminatory laws. Third, the Black federal workers face systemic discrimination, even as the UN points to the lack of progress on this matter. Therefore, the next government must appoint a Black Equity Commissioner. Ensure that Black workers get their remedies. Develop support systems for Black federal employees, investigate complaints and conduct regular audits, and support the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. Fourth, Canada must combat anti-discrimination and anti-immigration discourse and must meet its international obligations to protect refugees. In particular, the next government must withdraw from the Safe Third Country Agreement, overhaul the temporary foreign migrant workers, and end the use of prisons for immigration detention. Ensure access to basic health care. To all parties in this election, human rights are not bargaining chips. They are not privileges bestowed or withheld by the powerful. They are assets of humanity the best right of all human beings. It is your duty to campaign and govern with this truth at the forefront of your policies and legislation. Let us judge the success of our government not only by the wealth of our economy, but also by our commitment to justice. Let us measure progress not by the power of the few, but by the dignity of all of us. I now yield the time to my colleague from the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Georgina Alonso, and I'm here today from above ground on behalf of the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability. Our contribution to this collaborative effort is to highlight that any serious human rights platform must include corporate accountability. For too long, Canadian transnationals and importers have been able to profit from widespread and egregious human rights abuses and environmental destruction. These abuses include killings, sexual violence, water contamination, land grabs, forced labor, and others. From the food we eat, to the clothes we wear, to the metals in our phones, we are all implicated. The Canadian government has a documented record of promoting and supporting international operations of Canadian companies linked to serious human rights violations. This has been done through embassy and diplomatic support and direct financial backing. By contrast, the Canadian government has a responsibility to ensure that all human rights are protected, including by regulating Canadian companies. However, these companies are often able to operate with impunity because they are not subject to binding rules and because companies structure their global operations to avoid liability. Canada has relied almost exclusively on voluntary approaches to address corporate human rights abuse. Yet evidence shows that voluntary approaches don't work. With this platform, we are amplifying the resounding call from communities and workers around the world who demand that the Canadian government finally hold its companies accountable by ending undue support and by implementing legislation to ensure that those harmed by Canadian companies have access to justice and remedy. The next Canadian government has an opportunity to answer this call and to become a global leader on human rights. I will now hand this over to my colleague at the David Suzuki Foundation.
Good morning. I'm Lisa Gu, National Policy Manager with the David Suzuki Foundation. The David Suzuki Foundation is calling on all parties, candidates, and voters to make election 2025 count for people and the planet. At a time when politics can feel divisive and polarized, let's unite around environmental and social justice values. In 2022, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a landmark resolution formally recognizing the right to a healthy environment. Furthermore, a healthy environment is necessary for the full realization of a range of human rights, such as the right to life and the right to water. At the same time, the human right to a healthy environment cannot be fulfilled without upholding other fundamental human rights, such as the right to free speech, the right to protest, and the rights of Indigenous peoples, as well as robust environmental protections. Human rights and the environment are interdependent. Accelerating climate change poses a direct threat to our right to a healthy environment and also to the human rights to life, health, food, water, housing, education, decent work, and cultural rights. As Canadian voters head to the ballot box, climate change is no longer a faraway problem. In recent years, extreme weather events have brought the climate crisis to our doorsteps, displacing communities across the country. The Canadian Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the global average. No wonder a recent poll showed 2 out of 3 people in Canada want the next federal government to make climate action and nature a high priority. Fossil fuels are the unequivocal source of the climate crisis, According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the continued exploitation and expansion of oil, coal, and gas have already had profound and cascading impacts across the full spectrum of human rights. This is why the collective call to action we're releasing today highlights a series of priority actions for protecting climate and advancing environmental justice. Let's make election 2025 count for people and the planet. Let me now introduce Michelle Biss with the National Right to Housing Network.
Good morning. My name is Michelle Biss, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Right to Housing Network. Housing is a fundamental human right, and everyone deserves a safe, stable, and affordable place to live. But as many of us know personally, far too many people across Canada are denied this fundamental human right, as they're evicted, as they're priced out, or as they face systemic barriers that push them into homelessness or precarious housing. In 2019, Canada passed the National Housing Strategy Act, which requires the federal government to create housing policy that is consistent with human rights and genuinely ends the housing and homelessness crisis. This means policy measures like protecting and expanding community housing, housing like public housing, nonprofit housing, and cooperative housing. It means policies like implementing national standards for renters' rights and increasing funding for tenant organizing, advocacy, and legal services. It means preventing and reversing the financialization of housing in Canada, creating stronger protections against corporate landlords who raise rents and evict tenants, and strengthening the regulation of institutional investors to curb tenant affordability erosion. It means addressing systemic barriers to housing for marginalized groups, like ensuring that at least 25% of federal housing investments actually do support women and gender diverse focused affordable housing projects. It also means expanding disability inclusive housing policies. And lastly, it means strengthening federal leadership on homelessness and housing precarity. Like the goals we have set to reduce carbon emissions by 2030, I want to hear from leaders of all political parties on their timeline of when Canada will end homelessness and the plan to get us there and to measure our progress along the way. Canada is one of the richest countries in the world. We are a member of the G7, and the fact that at least 235,000 people are experiencing homelessness is just not something that we can accept any longer. We join our partners today in calling for justice, for dignity, and equality at the center of the next federal government's policies. This election is an opportunity for political leaders to step up and demonstrate their commitment to treat housing not as a commodity, but as the human right that it is. I will now hand it over to my colleague, Kelsey Gallagher at Plowshares.
Thank you very much. My name is Kelsey Gallagher, Senior Researcher with Project Plowshares. Canada has failed to fully implement all of its obligations under the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty while continuing to transfer conventional weapons systems to serial human rights abusers. In 2023, Canada exported more weapons to Israel than ever before, valued at more than $30 million. And since the beginning of Israel's ongoing bombardment of Gaza, which has killed more than 50,000 Palestinians, Canada has continued to export weapon systems to Israel, including components shipped through the United States that are used in the very aircraft carrying out the airstrikes. As per Article 7.3 of the Arms Trade Treaty, Canadian officials must cease arms transfers to Israel and thereafter close all regulatory loopholes that allow their unregulated transfer to third parties via the US. Saudi Arabia, one of the most repressive regimes on the planet, remains among Canada's top non-US recipients of weapon systems and deployed Canadian-made light armored vehicles throughout its intervention in Yemen, where leading human rights monitors found it violated international humanitarian law. The next government must end these arms transfers or risk Canadian-made weapons being used in future humanitarian crises like that in Yemen, or against Saudi civilians by their own authoritarian government. Canada recently also overturned an embargo on the export of drone components to Turkey, despite that country's blatant diversion of Canadian weapon systems, including in violation of UN arms embargoes. Canadian officials should reinstate a presumption of denial policy on the transfer of drone components to Turkey, or risk again seeing this technology in the hands of bad actors. Our contribution to this platform is to remind Canada that its international arms control obligations are non-negotiable, and that the Government of Canada must adjust its course to realize a just foreign policy. Problematic arms transfers have deadly consequences for civilians around the world. This reality must guide the next government's approach to regulating the trade and transfer of conventional weapon systems. Thank you very much.
We don't have any question at the moment. Is there something you would like to add to your statement?
No, thank you. We are expecting questions. If there aren't, actually, you can check the platform that we're talking about on VoteForRights.ca. VoteForRights.ca. You will find the platform there and all the information. Thank you.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference. Merci. C'est ce qui conclut cette conférence de presse.
Recording stopped.